Hello and welcome to today's video. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the Planar decal system introduced in Modo 16.1. Decals are essentially stickers that are projected onto the surface of an object. They let you create additional details on your model, such as displacement, graffiti, and logos. Previously, decals could be created in Modo, but they were difficult to edit and were baked into your material, making it hard to make adjustments. Modo 16.1 includes a powerful toolset that makes it easy to add decals and then style them any way you like. They're fully editable and modifiable without the need to bake them into your textures, which fixes them in place. Instead of applying decals via the shader tree or baking them into a texture map, Planar decals project a mesh plane containing your decal textures onto a chosen object so that the images that you want to place are layered on top of your object instead of stored in your shader. This allows you to move, scale, and rotate your decals as if they were a 3D object whenever you need to, without having to worry about how the decal is impacting your model or any additional materials. By using decals that are powered by normal and displacement maps, decals are also a really brilliant way to add complexity to a model without increasing your poly count, saving you vital processing power, something that's essential for game environments. In this tutorial, we'll be using decals to add surface details to this robot model. I'll show you how to set up a decal, as well as the two ways that planar decals can be projected onto the surface of an object. Both workflows are fully procedural, but the first setup that we'll take a look at is a manual approach where we create and set up the decal plane on Meshop, and then hand place our decal on our object. The second approach is a more automatic one, and uses the new Decals button available in the Create tab and the Mesh Paint Replica tool. By clicking the Decals button, we're able to tell Modo what decal to use as well as what mesh to project the decal on. Once clicked, we get access to the Mesh Paint Replica tool. In this tool, we can also place multiple decals as well as edit their position, size, and rotation. So, let's get started. Before we can apply our decal, we need to set one up. For this decal, we'll be using normal, ambient occlusion, and curvature maps, as well as a mask. However, there aren't any set rules on what texture maps you should or shouldn't be using. So the first thing that we need to do is create a plane to carry our decal. If we hold down Shift, we get access to the plane tool in the Create tab. If we click this, Modo creates a 1x1 meter plane on the origin. Because my model is also set on the origin, I'm going to hide the visibility of it by holding Shift and then selecting all parts of the model in the items tree and then clicking this eye icon. Now we can see our plane and it should be a lot easier to set up. This size is perfect for the asset that we're using, but if you're working on a different asset, you may need to scale the plane to suit the size of your model. Bear in mind though that if you're scaling this plane before projecting it, you'll need to do so in component mode like polygon selection instead of item mode, so that the plane's overall transforms remain at 0. Now that we have a plane, let's rename it to something like Decal 1 so it's easier to keep track of later. Once renamed, select the decal and press M on your keyboard to assign a new material to the plane. This material will contain all the image maps that are being used to drive the decal. Settings like colour and diffuse amount can be left as is, but make sure to name the decal something like Decal 1 so we can easily identify which material we need to add our textures to. Once the material has been named, press OK. So with the plane and the material set up, open up the shader tree by clicking this tab at the top of the items list. In here, we can see that we have our default material as well as the material that we created for our decal. To add our texture maps to the decal material, it's as simple as dragging and dropping the maps onto the material in the shader tree. Because my maps have their roles in the file name, we can actually turn on the PBR loader, and when we drag and drop the textures into the material, their roles are automatically assigned. The PBR loader takes a look at these suffixes and then assigns the texture to its corresponding effect. This is especially useful if you're planning to use a decal that was provided as a preset, as many images that come from a material preset may contain a suffix defining which effect each texture map has within the material. All of this is detailed in the documentation for Modo, so if you need any more information, feel free to head over to the link displayed on screen. So with that turned on, I'm going to grab my normal, curvature and ambient occlusion maps as well as my mask and then drag them into my material. Because we turned the PBR loader on, we can see that the normal map has already been tagged as a normal map. The curvature and ambient occlusion maps are still being treated as diffuse though. The reason for this is because by default, they haven't been defined in the PBR loader as having a corresponding effect. If we hold down Alt and then click the PBR loader again, we can actually see which texture effects have suffixes set to correspond to them. Ambient occlusion and curvature coming in as diffuse maps aren't an issue for this workflow, but if you want to automate your workflows in the future, you can really easily set a suffix in this window by typing in suffixes in the text box next to the map that you want to be imported, and then checking the checkbox next to the effect name. We can also input multiple suffixes in this text box, but make sure that they're all separated by a semicolon. Also, as a side note, I've been using the advanced viewport while creating this material. If you find that your textures or your environment lights aren't showing properly, make sure that your display viewport is set to advanced and not default by looking at this option in the top left of the viewport. All that being said, if you're not using images that have defined suffixes in the file name, don't worry, you can really easily set the roles of your textures by clicking in this effect column and then either searching for the role and then selecting it, or by selecting it from one of the options in this menu. For example, my mask has been brought in as a group mask, but we actually want it to be acting as a stencil. To change its effect, let's click on this group mask effect and then type in stencil. Once it pops up in the search results, we can hit enter or click on stencil and the effect is set. The stencil is inverted right now, so it's actually removing the decal and keeping everything that we don't want. So to fix this, let's go to the properties menu for this texture and then check invert. The mask is now inverted and is masking out everything other than our decal. With the normal map and the mask layer both set, what we're going to do with our curvature and ambient occlusion masks is select both of them in the shader tree and then click in the blending mode column to set both maps to multiply. Once multiplied, we can click and drag in the opacity column to adjust the opacity until we like the look of the decal. I'll be leaving the ambient occlusion at 100% opacity and then bringing the curvature right down, but feel free to have a play about with opacities until you get a look that you like. Once this decal is set up, we can also save it out as a material preset so we can reuse it in other scenes without needing to set our material up each time. We can do this by right-clicking on our material in the shader tree and then selecting Save as Material Assembly preset within the Presets submenu. Once clicked, the Save Preset window opens. In this window, click Save Preset. In the Explorer window that opens, give your material preset a name and a place for it to be saved, and then click Save. Once saved, you can really easily drag and drop your material preset into the shader tree, and all the effects, blending modes and opacities that we just set are preserved. Okay, so now that we have our materials and our textures set up, we have a decal that can be projected. Now that we have a decal, there are two ways that we can project it onto the surface of our mesh. The first method that we're going to take a look at is by manually setting up the Planar decal mesh operation and then placing it on our mesh. So the first thing that I'm going to do is move our decal off the origin of the work plane, just so it's a bit easier to access. As mentioned before, whenever we need to move our decal, we need to move it in item mode instead of component mode, so we can keep our transforms at 0. It's important to do this because if the transforms aren't at 0, the decal might not project properly. This also applies for the model that you're projecting on as well. If there are any transforms on your model, such as rotate or position, they need to be frozen so that all of the values are back to 0. Our asset is already frozen, but if you need to freeze the transforms on a model, you can do so by clicking Freeze in the Items Property menu, and then selecting which transforms you want to freeze. To move the decal, press 5 on your keyboard to enter item mode, and then click on the decal. Once selected, press W to activate the transform handle, and then click and drag that handle to move the decal off to the side slightly. With the decal moved, let's turn the visibility of the model back on by holding down Shift, selecting all parts of the model in the items list, and then clicking the eye icon. With the model's visibility back on, we can set up the Decal Planar Meshop that's going to be projecting the decal. To do this, press N to create a new mesh item. This is going to contain the Decal Planar Meshop, so make sure that it's left empty for now. To keep the items list manageable as we add more items to the list, let's also rename this mesh item to something like Floating Decal. Once that new mesh item is created, open the Mesh Operations viewport. If you're working in the Modo layout, this is done by clicking this button next to the items list. With the Mesh Operations viewport open, click Add Operator. In the menu that opens, type Decal into the search box and select Decal Planar from the results. Once selected, the Create Decal Planar Mesh Operation window opens. In this window, we can determine the mesh that we want the decal to be placed on, as well as the decal that we want to place. In the Target Mesh parameter, we're going to select the mesh that we want the decal to be placed on. I want my decal to be placed on this chunk of mesh, so let's select Side from the dropdown. In the Source Planar Mesh parameter, we're going to tell Modo which decal we want to project onto the target mesh. We only have one decal in the scene right now, so let's select that from the dropdown. Most of the other settings in this window can be left as is, but we should take a look at Offset before clicking OK. What Offset does is determine how far from the surface of your mesh that the decal will sit. If we leave it at 0, the decal will actually be intersecting with the mesh, meaning that we might get some display issues. To avoid this, let's change the offset to something like 1mm so it's floating just above the surface of the mesh. With that set, we can press OK. Now, it looks like the only thing that's happened is that we can't see our decal anymore. This is expected because the decal hasn't actually been placed on the mesh yet. To place the decal, click and drag the decal in the items list and then hold it over the mesh that you want it to be placed on. After a second, the Drop Actions menu becomes available to you. In this menu, select Place and Align. Once selected, we can see that the decal is now placed on the mesh. Now that the decal is on the mesh, there are a few things that we can do to make sure that it's properly aligned on the surface of our mesh. So, for example, this decal is actually way too big for where we've placed it. Luckily, it's super easy to resize a decal even after it's been placed. All we need to do is select the decal in the items tree, or by using item mode, and then press R to scale it. Because decals work best when they're aligned to the surface normals of a mesh that they're being projected onto, we should also change our action center to local. This can be done by clicking this button at the top of the viewport and then selecting local. Once the action center is changed, the orientation of the transform handles change so that they're aligned to the surface of the mesh. This basically allows us to scale our decal in context of how it's been placed. With the scale tool active and the decal selected in item mode, let's scale this decal down a bit. As I'm scaling my decal, I'm also noticing that the positioning of the decal is a bit off, and I want it to be rotated so it's upright instead of skewed to the side. As long as local and item mode are active, we can also adjust the position and rotation of the decal on the model in the same way we scaled it. But instead of pressing R to scale, press W to move the decal and E to rotate it. Now that the decal is placed on the mesh, if we rotate the viewport a bit, it looks like this decal is actually being stretched across the surface. There are a couple ways that we can fix this, so let's take a look at the Properties menu for the Decal Planar Meshop. To access the Meshop's properties, make sure the floating decal mesh item is selected in the items list, and then select the planar decal in the Meshop's viewport. The first thing that I want to do in the properties menu is adjust the relax mode and the UV iteration for this decal. The way that decal projections in Modo work is by creating a boolean of the mesh that is carrying the decal, and then relaxing the UVs of that mesh over the mesh that we're projecting the decal onto. If we open up the UV viewport and select the UV texture option here, we can see that we have UVs for our decal being relaxed on top of the UVs for the model. If we go back to the Meshop's properties menu and then cycle through the different options for relax mode, we can see that the UV map of the decal is changing depending on what mode we're using. However, looking at how the decal is sitting on the mesh, I think that adaptive mode probably looks best. It is, however, still a bit stretched. This is where UV iteration comes in. This controls how many times the UVs for the decal are relaxed. The more it's relaxed, the less distortion we have, so let's click and drag these arrows in the relaxed iteration input to raise the amount of iterations we have until the distortion is gone. So for this decal, it looks like 40 iterations has done the trick. If we close the UV viewport and then rotate around our model, we can see that most of the distortion is gone and the decal is looking good. Now, there are two more really important settings in the properties menu that I want to go over. The first one is one that I mentioned earlier, and that's offset. Offset controls how far away from the mesh the decal sits, and it's useful if you're planning to layer decals or have some really complex geo that's being projected on. If I increase the offset amount, we can see that the decal is now floating further away from the mesh and is no longer sat on top of it. We don't want this, so I'm going to drop that back down to 1mm. The second important option to be aware of are the positive and negative depth options. What these two options do is determine the planar projector's location in relation to the mesh. Positive depth determines how far into the mesh the decal should be projected, while negative depth determines how far away from the mesh the projector needs to be. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to replace my decal by dragging it from the items list and then align and placing it onto the model again. Right now it looks fine, but if I turn off the visibility of this top piece and then look inside the model, we can see that we've actually ended up with more than one decal. To fix this, we need to adjust the positive and negative depths of the decal. The easiest way to do this is by enabling the Show Depth Handle option in the Properties menu. This allows us to adjust our positive and negative depths in the viewport instead of having to manually put values in the parameters. If you're not seeing the depth handles in the viewport after enabling them, you may need to press Q to drop any active tools. So with the handles active, click and drag the blue handle to increase the positive depth. When doing this, it might look like the decal has disappeared, but this is fine. To get it back on the mesh, click and drag the red handle to increase the negative depth. The decal is now back on the mesh, and if we take a look at the inside portion of our model, we can see that some of our unwanted decals are gone, but some are still being projected through. To fix this, all we need to do is drag that blue handle again until it disappears. Now if we look at the front again, we have one decal that's being projected nicely and is only on the front of the model. So with those all set, we now have our first decal. So I mentioned before that there are actually two ways that we can create a decal. The first is the manual setup that we just went over, but the second is an automated setup that can be accessed by clicking the Decals button available in the Create tab. But before we can do that, we need to make sure that we have some decals in our scene. We already have one set up from earlier, but the really cool thing about the Decals button is that we can use multiple decals at once. First off, we're going to turn off the visibility of the model and then create another decal using the same method as before. First, we're going to create a plane by holding Shift and then pressing the Plane button in the Create tab. Once created, let's rename this new plane to Decal 2, and then with the new plane selected, let's press M to create a new material. Name this material Decal 2 or something similar so it's easier to find in the shader tree, and then press OK. Once the material is created, let's go to the shader tree so we can apply our maps. Again, my maps follow PBR naming conventions, so I'll be turning on the PBR loader before dragging my maps into the material. With the PBR loader turned on, I'm going to grab my normal, curvature, ambient occlusion and mask textures from the file browser and then drag them into the material. The normal map is already set to a normal effect, so this can be left as is. For the mask, we're going to click in the effects column and then set the effect to stencil. Once again, the mask is inverted, so let's go to the properties tab for this texture and then click invert. With the mask masking correctly, let's select the curvature and ambient occlusion maps in the shader tree and then change the mode to multiply in the blending mode column. Once set, let's adjust the opacity of the curvature map in the opacity column. With all of our effects set, let's select all of those textures in the shader tree by selecting the first map in the material, holding down Shift and then selecting the last map in the material. With all of those selected, let's go to the Locator tab in the Properties menu and then set the horizontal and vertical repeat to edge so our decal doesn't tile if we need to adjust the UV relax mode or UV iteration later on. With those textures applied, we can now select our decal in item mode and then shunt it off to the side a bit so it's not covered by our model once visibility is turned back on. With that set up, let's make the model visible again by selecting all parts of the model in the items list and then clicking the eye icon. So to set up a decal with the Decals button, all we need to do is press the Decals button. Once pressed, we get a window very similar to the one that we got when creating the Decal Planar Meshop. In the Target Mesh option, we're going to choose the mesh that we want to apply our decal to, and then in the Scene Decal option, we're going to choose the decal that we want to project. Once everything is set, click OK. Once OK is pressed, you might think that nothing has happened. Visually, we can't see a decal, and this is because we haven't placed it yet. But if we take a look at the items list, we actually have a new folder called Decal. If we expand this folder, we can see that we actually have two mesh items, one called Decal Mesh and the other called Decal Source Merged. These two items work in the same way as the Decal Planar Meshop that we created earlier, and all the Decal button does is automate this setup and give you an easier way to project multiple decals on a mesh. So the other thing that you may have noticed is that as soon as we clicked OK, the Mesh Paint Replica tool became active. This tool is how we'll be placing our decals and then editing them later on. To place our decal, all we need to do is click on our mesh with the Mesh Paint Replica tool active. While Mesh Paint Replica is active, we can continue to click on the mesh to add additional decals. However, if you want to change the size of the decal before you place it, all you need to do is hold down your right mouse button and then drag to change the size of the brush when placing them. A really cool thing about this method of creating decals is that it also works off replicators, which means that as long as we don't drop the tool, we can continue to apply multiple decals in one go. As we apply more decals to our mesh, if we go back to the items list, we can see that there's now a folder called Decal2 Replicator. If we expand that folder again, we can see that we now have a point cloud and a replicator in that folder. The replicator basically acts as a container for all of our placed decals, while the point cloud holds all the information as to where our decals are being placed. Earlier I mentioned that you can manage multiple decals using the Decal button and Mesh Paint Replica. To do this, all we need to do is create a second decal using the Decals button, and then switch between the two by changing the decal in the item parameter under Replica Effector in the tool properties in Mesh Paint Replica. So let's start by setting up that second decal. Press the Decals button again, and then assign the mesh that you want to project a decal onto in the target mesh parameter. Once set, select the decal that you want to project in the scene decal parameter and press OK. Once pressed, we can draw the new decal onto our mesh. If we decide that we want to use our previous decal again, all we need to do is go to the Tool Properties menu to the left of the viewport and then scroll down to the Replica Effector menu. In this menu, if we change the item to our other decal and then place it on our mesh, we can see that we've swapped out the decal that we just made for the decal that we had before. Now, this is all good, but what if we want to change the size or placement of our decals after we've placed them? This is really easily doable in the Mesh Paint Replica tool by clicking the Edit Mode button at the top of the Tools Properties menu. Once clicked, these blue squares appear on your decal. This means that they're editable. However, please be aware that the decals that become editable are driven by the decal that is set in the item parameter that we just changed. If you have multiple decals that you want to edit, you'll need to swap between them in that item parameter to make them editable. Once edit mode is enabled, you can click and drag your decal to move them on the surface of the mesh, or click and drag this circle to rotate them. If you want to change the size of your decal, you can select the decal, type in a new size in the size parameter in the Tools Properties, and then click the decal again to resize it. If you want to draw more decals on your mesh, you can exit edit mode by clicking the standard mode button and then clicking on your mesh. So I mentioned earlier that offset is used to control how far from the surface of a mesh that the decal sits. This is especially important when layering decals on top of each other. If we move our screw decals so that they're sat on top of this recessed decal, we can see that these bolts aren't really sitting on top of that first decal. This is because both of them have an offset of 1mm, so they're actually sitting the same distance away from the surface of the mesh. However, it's really important to note that the offset in the Mesh Paint Replica tool and the offset in the Decal Planar Meshop do not operate in the same way. If we click and drag this handle while edit mode is active, we can see that the decal isn't actually moving any further from the mesh. What's actually being moved is the plane that's projecting the decal and not the decal itself. If we want to move the decal off the surface of the mesh, we need to adjust the offset in the Decal Planar Meshop. I mentioned earlier that when a decal is projected, it's essentially creating a boolean of the plane that's carrying the geometry. So to move that boolean above the mesh, we need to edit that directly. If I move the decal on my mesh so it's wrapping around a corner, we can see what I mean a bit better. The boolean that's being created by the Decal Planar Meshop is being projected onto and is conforming with the surface of the mesh, while the plane carrying the decal is not. If I click and drag on this handle, we can see that the plane is moving further away from the mesh, while the decal is staying in the same place. If we move that decal back so it's overlapping the recessed one, it may look like the decal is sitting on top of the other one, but in reality, only the plane containing the decal has been offset and not the decal itself. So to change the offset of the decal that's been placed on the mesh, we need to select the decal mesh item in the folder that was created when you created the decal that you're currently editing. For example, I'm editing the second decal that I made, so I'll be selecting the decal mesh item in the decal 2 folder. Once selected, select the decal op Meshop in the mesh operations viewport so we have access to the Meshop's properties. In the properties tab, let's change the decal's offset to something like 2mm. That offset plane is actually now getting in the way, so let's grab that transform handle in the viewport and then drag it backwards so it's back to 1mm or thereabouts. With that moved, we can see that our decal is now sitting nicely one on top of the other. While we're in edit mode, let's also adjust the size and positioning of these bolt decals. To do this, select the decal that you want to move in the Tool Properties menu, and then input a size that you want your decal to be in the X, Y and Z size parameters. To change all of these parameters at once, you can click this icon in the parameter input to carry changes through to all inputs. Once I've determined a new size, I'm also going to change that offset to 1mm so we don't end up with a decal plane floating above our mesh again, and then click and drag our decal into place. As we move the decal, we can see that it resizes and the floating decal stays at 1mm. A really cool thing about Modo in general is that once you adjust the options within a tool, those changes are stored until they're manually changed again. This means that all we need to do to get these other 2 decals to match the size of the one that we just moved is click on them and then drag them into position. With those decals now in place, let's go back to the decal planar Meshop properties. While adjusting the offset of our decal, you may have noticed that all of the bolt decals also had their offsets changed. This is because any changes in the Meshop are carried over to all decals being driven by that Meshop. This means that you don't have to manually change the offset or positive and or negative depths of your decals individually. Speaking of positive and negative depths, changing the depths of a decal created by the Decals button is exactly the same as adjusting a decal that was manually set up. All we need to do is select the mesh item containing our planar decal Meshop and enable Show Depth Handles in the Meshop's properties. If we press Q to drop the Mesh Paint Replica tool and then enable the depth handles, we can adjust the positive and negative depths of our decals in the same way that we adjusted them earlier. As with when we changed offset, these changes are applied to all of the decals that this Meshop is driving. Because we dropped the Mesh Paint Replica tool to enable the depth handles, you may be thinking that there's no way to keep editing our decals or place new ones. This isn't the case, and it's really easy to reactivate the Mesh Paint Replica tool and place additional decals or edit ones that we already have. All we need to do is activate the Mesh Paint Replica, either by clicking the button in the Create tab, or by right-clicking the Mesh Paint button and then selecting Mesh Paint Replica from the menu that appears to activate the tool. As long as your decals are properly set in that item parameter, you are able to place more decals or enter edit mode to continue to edit them. And there we have it, a quick and easy way to create and layer multiple decals on a mesh without having to set up complex projections. For more information on Modo, such as documentation and additional tutorials, head over to learn.foundry.com/Modo.